In the summer of 1842, on a Virginia plantation where black bodies were bought and sold like livestock, a group of enslaved people discovered something that would change everything. They realized that while white masters could chain their bodies, steal their labor, and control their movements, there was one thing no amount of violence could ever take from them: the extraordinary power of their minds. And they were about to use that power in ways their oppressors never imagined. Before we dive into this remarkable story of intellectual resistance and mental fortitude, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you powerful stories of courage, intelligence, and the unbreakable human spirit every single week. These are the histories that deserve to be remembered, the black minds that changed the world despite impossible odds, the ancestors whose brilliance could not be extinguished. Now, let me take you back to 1842, to a place called the Harrison Plantation, where a revolution of the mind was about to begin. The Harrison Plantation stretched across 1,500 acres of Virginia's fertile soil. Its fields worked by 73 enslaved black people whose bodies generated wealth they would never see. The main house stood on a hill overlooking those fields, a white colonial structure with tall columns that spoke of prosperity built entirely on stolen black labor. Behind it, arranged in 2 rows, stood the quarters where black families lived in cramped cabins, where children were born into bondage, where elders died never having known freedom, where humanity persisted against systematic attempts to destroy it. Thomas Harrison was the white man who claimed ownership of these black lives. He was 48 years old, a third-generation plantation owner who'd inherited both land and the people who worked it. He considered himself an enlightened master, believing that his relatively moderate use of physical punishment made him benevolent compared to some neighbors. He never understood that any amount of ownership of human beings was evil, that moderate brutality was still brutality, that claiming to own people was itself the deepest violation, regardless of how that ownership was exercised. William Brennan served as overseer, a cruel white man who believed black people were inherently inferior and required harsh control to remain productive. He carried a whip and used it regularly, patrolled the fields looking for any sign of resistance or independent thought, enforced rules designed to keep black people ignorant and broken. Brennan understood at some instinctive level that educated black people were dangerous to white supremacy, that thinking black people threatened the entire system, so he worked hard to prevent both education and independent thought. But what Brennan never understood, what Harrison never comprehended, what white supremacy in general failed to grasp, was that the human mind cannot be truly enslaved. You can control bodies through violence. You can limit movement through chains. You can restrict behavior through laws. But the mind, the spirit, the essential humanity of a person, these exist beyond physical control. And the black people on the Harrison Plantation understood this truth in ways their white oppressors never could. Marcus was 32 years old in 1842, a black man born into slavery on the Harrison Plantation. His mother, Ruth, had been a houseworker, a dark-skinned woman whose intelligence had been deliberately ignored by the white family she served. His father, Samuel, had been sold south when Marcus was 5 years old, torn away from his family to satisfy Harrison's father's gambling debts. Marcus remembered his father's dark face, the strength in his hands, the stories he'd told about Africa that his own grandmother had passed down to him, memories of a place where black people had been free, where they'd built kingdoms and cities, where they'd been fully human in ways slavery tried to deny. From his earliest memories, Marcus possessed a gift that would define his life and change his community. He had what people today might call a photographic memory, the ability to remember everything he saw or heard with perfect clarity. As a black child working in the fields, Marcus would overhear conversations between white people, store them away in his mind with complete accuracy. He'd see documents, letters, newspapers that white people left carelessly lying around, and he'd memorize them word for word, despite never having been taught to read in the conventional sense. His mind worked like a vast library, cataloging information, making connections, building understanding of the world that slavery tried to keep hidden from black people. But Marcus understood something crucial about survival. He hid his exceptional memory behind a mask of simple obedience. When white people were present, he played the role they expected, the unquestioning black laborer who followed orders without thought. He understood that revealing his intelligence would bring danger, that exceptional black people drew attention that could lead to being sold away or worse. So Marcus observed, remembered, learned, and waited for the right moments to use his gifts. Sarah was 28, a black woman who worked in the Harrison main house as a cook. Her dark hands prepared elaborate meals for the white family, while her own children received bare rations. But Sarah possessed something beyond cooking skills. She had an extraordinary ability to read people, to understand motivations and psychology, to see through lies and manipulations. This black woman could observe how white people interacted and predict their actions with uncanny accuracy. She understood power dynamics, social hierarchies, the complex ways that white people maintained control over black people. And she used that understanding to navigate the dangerous waters of plantation life, protecting herself and other black people whenever possible. Sarah had learned these skills from her grandmother, an African woman who'd been stolen from her homeland and transported to America in chains. That grandmother, called Mama Kesso, had possessed deep knowledge of human nature, psychological insights that predated American slavery. Before being captured, Mama Kesso had been what her people called a reader of souls, someone who could perceive truths about people that others missed. She'd passed that knowledge to Sarah's mother, who'd passed it to Sarah, creating a chain of wisdom that stretched from African freedom through American bondage, knowledge that slavery couldn't erase. Benjamin was 19, a young black man who possessed mathematical genius that he'd never been formally taught. This young man could calculate complex problems in his head, could understand patterns and relationships between numbers, could project outcomes and probabilities with extraordinary accuracy. Benjamin had taught himself mathematics by watching white children being tutored, by stealing glimpses of their textbooks, by working through problems in his mind during the long hours of field labor. His black mind had grasped concepts that many educated white people struggled with, had developed understanding that slavery insisted black people were incapable of achieving. These three, Marcus, Sarah, and Benjamin, formed the core of what would become an underground network of intellectual resistance on the Harrison plantation. They'd recognized each other's exceptional abilities through careful observation, through subtle signals that other black people understood, but white people missed. And in the spring of 1842, they decided it was time to do something more than just survive. It was time to use their minds as weapons against the system that tried to break them. The catalyst came on a warm April evening when Marcus overheard a conversation that changed everything. He was working in the barn, supposedly cleaning equipment, when Harrison and Brennan entered to discuss plantation business. They assumed Marcus was too stupid to understand, or too cowed to care about what white men discussed. They were wrong on both counts. "We need to increase productivity," Harrison said, his white voice carrying frustration. "Cotton prices are down. Tobacco isn't yielding what it should. We need to get more work out of the hands without buying more slaves." "We could increase the hours," Brennan suggested. "Start them earlier, keep them working later." "They're already working from dawn to dark," Harrison replied. "Push them harder and we'll start losing people to exhaustion or illness. That costs money too."
"Then, we need to be more selective about who we keep," Brennan said coldly. "The older ones, the ones who can't work as hard anymore, we should sell them south. Replace them with younger, stronger workers." Marcus froze, his black hands still on the equipment he'd been cleaning. What they were discussing meant separating families, selling away elders who'd lived on this plantation their entire lives. tearing apart the black community that provided emotional and psychological survival for everyone. And it was being discussed as a purely economic calculation, as if black lives and black families meant nothing. There's also the problem of the younger ones learning too much from the older ones, Brennan continued. I've noticed some of them are getting ideas, thinking too much. We should separate them more, make sure the troublemakers aren't influencing the next generation. Harrison nodded. You're right. We've been too lax. Time to tighten control. Marcus listened to every word, committing the conversation to his perfect memory. And he understood that this wasn't just about economics. This was about breaking black spirits, about destroying black families, about preventing black people from passing knowledge and strength to their children. This was systematic destruction of black humanity, and Marcus knew he had to do something about it. That night, Marcus met with Sarah and Benjamin in a small clearing in the woods beyond the quarters. They'd developed a system for secret meetings, pretending to fetch water or check on non-existent problems with equipment, creating reasons to be away from the cabins that wouldn't draw white suspicion. The three black people sat under stars that had witnessed generations of black suffering and black resistance, and Marcus shared what he'd heard. They're planning to sell the elders, Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. Moses, Clara, maybe a dozen others. Break up families to increase profits. Sarah's dark face reflected anger and calculation. If they sell Moses, they'll destroy half our community. He's the one who settles disputes, who counsels the young people, who maintains our connection to the old ways. We have to stop it, Benjamin said firmly. But how? We can't openly defy them. That just brings punishment on everyone. We can't stop it with physical resistance, Marcus agreed. But maybe we can stop it with our minds. Maybe we can make Harrison see that selling the elders is bad business. Convince him there's a better way that still serves his interests while protecting our people. This was the revolutionary idea that would define everything that followed. Not open rebellion, which would bring violence down on the entire black community. Not escape, which was nearly impossible and would leave others vulnerable to reprisals. But intellectual resistance, using their minds to manipulate the system from within, protecting their community through strategic thinking and psychological insight.
Harrison is a businessman, Sarah said thoughtfully. He cares about profit. If we can show him that keeping the elders is more profitable than selling them, that breaking up families actually reduces productivity, he might listen. But how do we show him that? Benjamin asked. We can't just walk up and explain it. He'd punish us for speaking out of turn, and he'd never listen to slaves about plantation management. Marcus smiled slightly. We don't explain it directly. We make him discover it himself. We plant ideas that grow in his mind until he thinks they're his own. We manipulate events so that keeping the elders seems like the smart business decision. We use our knowledge of how he thinks, how he calculates, how he makes decisions. What they were proposing was extraordinarily dangerous. If discovered, they'd face severe punishment. But what they were facing if they did nothing was the destruction of their community. So these three brilliant black minds began planning one of the most sophisticated psychological operations ever conceived by enslaved people. Sarah, with her ability to read people, would analyze Harrison's personality, predict his reactions, identify the psychological levers that could influence his decisions. Benjamin, with his mathematical genius, would calculate productivity figures, create data that supported keeping families together, build an economic case that appealed to Harrison's business instincts. Marcus, with his perfect memory, would track every detail, remember every conversation, ensure consistency in their approach. Together, these three black people would weaponize their intelligence against the system that tried to deny black intelligence existed. Over the next 2 weeks, they began implementing their plan. Sarah accidentally left certain books open in the main house where Harrison would see them, books about plantation management that emphasized the productivity benefits of maintaining family units among enslaved workers. She dropped comments within Harrison's hearing about how hard the older workers were still contributing, how their experience improved overall efficiency, how the younger workers respected and learned from the elders. She did this subtly, never directly addressing Harrison, always making it seem like natural conversation with other houseworkers. Benjamin began doing something extraordinary with his work in the fields. He'd been assigned to track crop yields in different areas, a task that required basic counting. But Benjamin used his mathematical abilities to identify patterns that others missed. He noticed that fields where family groups worked together produced better yields than fields where people were randomly assigned. He noticed that younger workers were more productive when supervised by elders who taught techniques passed down through generations. She did this subtly, never directly addressing Harrison, always making it seem like natural conversation with other houseworkers. Benjamin began doing something extraordinary with his work in the fields. He'd been assigned to track crop yields in different areas, a task that required basic counting. But Benjamin used his mathematical abilities to identify patterns that others missed. He noticed that fields where family groups worked together produced better yields than fields where people were randomly assigned. He noticed that younger workers were more productive when supervised by elders who taught techniques passed down through generations. He began arranging work assignments to demonstrate these patterns, creating evidence that supported keeping families and elders together. Marcus used his memory to create psychological leverage. He remembered every time Harrison had expressed concerns about his reputation among other white planters. He remembered conversations where Harrison worried about being seen as cruel or backward compared to more progressive plantation owners. He remembered Harrison's father's deathbed advice about maintaining the value of property through careful management. Marcus shared these insights with Sarah and Benjamin, helping them craft approaches that would resonate with Harrison's specific psychology. Their plan required patience and perfect execution. They were three black people trying to manipulate a white man who held absolute legal power over their lives, trying to protect their community from destruction, trying to preserve black dignity and humanity through pure intellectual strategy. And slowly, carefully, their plan began working. Harrison started noticing the things Sarah had planted for him to notice. He observed, as if for the first time, how the older workers contributed to overall plantation efficiency. He read passages in the management books that confirmed the economic value of maintaining stable family units among enslaved workers. He began questioning whether Brennan's harsh approach was actually the most profitable strategy. Then Marcus created the decisive moment. He deliberately made a mistake while Harrison was nearby, a minor error in equipment maintenance that caused a small delay in field work. Brennan immediately moved to punish Marcus severely, as was his custom. But Marcus had calculated carefully. He knew that harsh punishment for minor mistakes often led to workers being too injured to work for days, costing more in lost productivity than the original error. As Brennan raised his whip, Marcus spoke, his voice respectful but clear. "Sir, I apologize for the error. I can fix it within the hour if I'm permitted to work. My father taught me the proper technique before he was sold, and I've been meaning to teach it to the younger workers so this kind of mistake doesn't happen again." It was a precisely calculated statement. Marcus was offering a solution rather than making excuses. He was reminding Harrison of the value of transmitted knowledge from older to younger workers. He was demonstrating the cost of separating families by mentioning his sold father, And he was doing all this while maintaining the submissive demeanor expected of enslaved black people. Harrison stopped Brennan's punishment. "Fix it," he ordered Marcus, "and yes, teach the younger ones properly. That's the kind of practical knowledge we need preserved." It was a small victory, but it represented something larger. Harrison had just acknowledged the value of preserving and transmitting knowledge among enslaved black people. He just admitted that experience mattered, that the elders who carried that experience had value beyond physical labor. Marcus, Sarah, and Benjamin's intellectual resistance was working. Over the following weeks, they continued their campaign. Benjamin arranged work assignments that subtly demonstrated the productivity benefits of stable family units and experienced elders. Sarah continued planting ideas through carefully orchestrated conversations and strategically placed reading materials. Marcus used his perfect memory to track every interaction, adjusting their approach based on Harrison's responses, ensuring consistency in their messaging. But they also did something equally important. They shared their knowledge with other black people on the plantation, teaching their community about intellectual resistance, about the power of strategic thinking, about using minds as weapons against oppression. They couldn't educate everyone, the risks were too great, but they identified other intelligent black people who could be trusted, who could contribute to the network of mental resistance they were building. Elijah was 46, a black man who'd worked on the Harrison plantation for 30 years. He possessed deep understanding of white psychology gained through decades of observation. Elijah joined their group, adding his insights about how to navigate white power structures, how to appeal to white self-interest while protecting black communities. Hannah was 25, a young black woman with extraordinary linguistic abilities. She could mimic accents and speech patterns perfectly, could understand the subtle ways that language reflected and reinforced power. Hannah taught the network how to phrase requests in ways that white people found acceptable, how to use language as a tool for protection and advancement. Jacob was 17, a black teenager with gifts for strategic planning. Despite his youth, Jacob could think several steps ahead, could anticipate consequences and plan accordingly. He brought fresh perspectives to the network, helping them think beyond immediate problems to long-term strategies for black survival and resistance. The network grew carefully, each new member selected for their intelligence and trustworthiness, each bringing unique mental abilities that strengthened the collective. They became an underground movement of brilliant black minds working together to protect their community, to preserve black dignity, to resist dehumanization through intellectual excellence. And their immediate goal, preventing the sale of elders, was succeeding. Harrison postponed the planned sales, influenced by the evidence his own observations had provided, evidence that Marcus, Sarah, and Benjamin had carefully crafted for him to find. The black community remained intact. Families stayed together. Knowledge continued flowing from elders to younger people. The mental weapon had worked. But Brennan, the white overseer, was growing suspicious. He noticed subtle changes in how the black workers carried themselves, small signs of increased confidence, minor acts of initiative that hadn't existed before. He couldn't identify anything specific enough to punish, but his instincts told him something was wrong. Black people were thinking too much, acting too independently, showing signs of coordination that suggested organized resistance. One evening, Brennan decided to investigate. He hid near the quarters after dark, watching for suspicious activity. And he saw Marcus, Sarah, and Benjamin slipping away toward the woods, heading for one of their secret meetings. Brennan followed quietly, his white mind convinced he was about to discover evidence of planned rebellion or escape. What he witnessed instead confused and enraged him. He couldn't hear specific words, but he saw these black people meeting secretly, clearly planning something. He saw them drawing in the dirt, apparently teaching each other. He saw a level of organization and intelligence among black people that contradicted everything white supremacy had taught him about black intellectual inferiority. Brennan returned to the quarters and immediately went to Harrison's house, demanding an emergency meeting. "We have a problem," he told Harrison. "Some of the slaves are meeting secretly in the woods, planning something. We need to take action immediately before this spreads." Harrison frowned. "What kind of planning? Have you seen weapons? Heard talk of escape or rebellion?" "Not exactly," Brennan admitted. "But they're organized. They're teaching each other things. That kind of coordination among slaves is always dangerous, even if we haven't identified the specific threat yet." "Which ones were meeting?" Harrison asked. "That boy Marcus, the cook Sarah, young Benjamin, maybe others." Harrison considered this. "Those are some of our best workers. Marcus has been teaching the younger ones practical skills, improving efficiency. Sarah runs the kitchen smoothly. Benjamin's work in the fields has actually improved productivity. Are you sure they're planning trouble?" "Any secret meetings among slaves are trouble," Brennan insisted. "We need to break this up. Sell at least one of them as an example. Show the others that coordination won't be tolerated." This was the moment that everything Marcus, Sarah, and Benjamin had worked for could be destroyed. If Harrison sided with Brennan's instincts, if he prioritized control over productivity, their entire network would be shattered. But they'd also been preparing for this possibility, understanding that intellectual resistance required planning for multiple contingencies. Sarah had anticipated that Brennan might discover their meetings. She'd discussed with the network what to do if their activities were exposed. The strategy they developed was risky but potentially brilliant. Rather than deny or hide, they would reframe their activities in ways that served Harrison's interests, transforming their intellectual resistance into something that appeared beneficial to plantation management. The next morning, before Harrison could act on Brennan's report, Marcus approached him with careful deference. "Master Harrison, I know Mr. Brennan reported seeing some of us meeting last night. I want to explain what we were doing, because I think you'll see it serves the plantation's interests." Harrison studied Marcus carefully. "Go on." "Some of us have been teaching each other work skills," Marcus explained, sticking carefully to truth while framing it in acceptable terms. "Things the older workers know that could help younger ones be more productive. Reading tracks in the woods for hunting, which improves our ability to supplement food rations. Calculating how to distribute work efficiently. Understanding weather patterns for better crop timing. We meet at night because that's the only time we have, and we meet in the woods because we didn't want to disturb others in the quarters." This was technically accurate, though it omitted the deeper purpose of intellectual development and psychological resistance. Marcus was betting that Harrison's business instincts would see value in skilled black workers, while Brennan's commitment to control would focus on the secretive nature of the meetings. "Why didn't you ask permission?" Harrison asked. "We should have," Marcus admitted. "We were wrong to meet without your knowledge. But we were trying to improve our work, make ourselves more valuable to the plantation. That seemed like something that would benefit everyone." Harrison turned to Brennan. "That sounds like useful activity, not rebellion planning." "Any unsupervised gathering of slaves is dangerous," Brennan insisted. "Today it's teaching work skills. Tomorrow it could be planning escape or worse. We need to maintain absolute control." And here was the fundamental conflict that Marcus, Sarah, and Benjamin had identified and were now exploiting. Brennan represented the old approach to slavery, maintaining control through terror and ignorance, assuming black people needed to be kept stupid and broken to remain enslaved. Harrison represented a newer approach, still evil, but more economically calculating, willing to permit limited black development if it increased productivity and profits. "I'll make a decision," Harrison said. "Marcus, you and the others can continue your skills training, but you'll do it openly, during Sunday afternoons when you have approved free time. You'll tell Brennan what you're teaching, so he can evaluate whether it's genuinely useful.
And this training will be presented as plantation-approved education for improved work performance. That way you get your skills development, Brennan maintains oversight, and we avoid any appearance of secret coordination. Understood?
Yes, Master Harrison, Marcus replied, hiding his satisfaction. What had just happened was extraordinary. Through quick thinking and psychological insight, Marcus had transformed exposure of their secret network into official approval for exactly the kind of intellectual development they'd been pursuing. The plantation would now formally permit black people gathering to teach each other skills, something that strengthened their community and mental resistance while appearing to serve white interests. But Brennan wasn't satisfied. Over the following weeks, he watched the approved Sunday meetings with growing unease. He saw how the black participants carried themselves with subtle pride. He noticed increased confidence, more independent decision-making during work, small acts of initiative that challenged his authority. He couldn't punish any specific action. Everything was within acceptable boundaries, but the overall pattern troubled him deeply. The white overseer began looking for opportunities to reassert control, to break the growing sense of black self-worth he detected. He found that opportunity when young Benjamin made a calculation error that resulted in a minor crop loss. It was a genuine mistake, the kind anyone could make, but Brennan decided to use it to demonstrate that black intelligence was unreliable, that thinking black people were dangerous, that control through fear remained necessary. Brennan ordered Benjamin whipped publicly, not for the error itself, but for presuming to make decisions above his station. The message was clear to everyone who witnessed it. Black people who thought too much, who acted too independently, who forgot their place, would be violently reminded of the reality of their enslavement. The whipping was brutal, designed to humiliate as much as to cause pain. Benjamin, this brilliant black teenager with mathematical genius, was stripped and beaten while the entire black community was forced to watch. Brennan wanted to send a message to Marcus, Sarah, and the entire network that intelligence didn't protect black people from white violence, that mental resistance would be crushed just like physical resistance. But Brennan's plan backfired in ways he couldn't anticipate. The whipping unified the black community in shared outrage. It demonstrated the arbitrary cruelty of white power. And it showed everyone, including some white people who witnessed it, that Brennan was punishing intelligence and initiative rather than actual wrongdoing. Even Harrison looked uncomfortable with the excessive punishment for a minor mistake. More importantly, the whipping clarified something for Marcus, Sarah, and the entire network. They'd been trying to work within the system, to use their minds to navigate slavery's constraints, to protect their community through strategic thinking that didn't directly challenge white authority. But Brennan's violence reminded them that white supremacy would always feel threatened by black intelligence, would always seek to crush independent black thought, would always use violence to maintain control. The network needed to become more sophisticated. They needed to operate more carefully. They needed to understand that intellectual resistance wasn't just about improving conditions, it was about fundamentally challenging the assumptions that made slavery possible. And they needed to prepare for a longer struggle than they'd initially imagined. That night, Sarah, Marcus, Elijah, and the other network members met in emergency session. Hannah brought news from the main house, where she'd overheard conversations between Harrison and visitors. Jacob shared observations about changing dynamics on the plantation. Everyone contributed their perspectives, their intelligence, their strategic insights. "Brennan sees us as a threat," Elijah said quietly. "Not because we're planning rebellion, but because we're thinking. And thinking black people terrify white people who base their entire worldview on our supposed inferiority." "We need to be more careful," Sarah added, "more strategic about how we present ourselves. We can't eliminate their fear of black intelligence, but we can minimize how much we trigger that fear while continuing to develop our minds and strengthen our community. There's something else, Marcus said thoughtfully. We've been focused on protecting this plantation, this community. But what we're doing, this network of mental resistance, could spread beyond here. Other plantations have intelligent black people who could use these strategies. We could teach them, create a wider movement of intellectual resistance. This was a revolutionary expansion of their vision. Not just protecting one community through strategic thinking, but spreading sophisticated mental resistance across multiple plantations, building a network of brilliant black minds working together to undermine slavery from within. But how do we spread these ideas without getting caught? Hannah asked. We can barely operate here under Brennan's suspicions. How could we possibly coordinate across plantations? The same way information has always spread among black people, Elijah replied, through those who travel between plantations, through black preachers at religious meetings, through people being sold or hired out. We just need to be more intentional about what information we spread and to whom. They began developing a system for identifying potential network members on other plantations. They created subtle signals that intelligent black people could use to recognize each other without alerting white people. They developed methods for teaching mental resistance strategies in ways that seemed like ordinary conversation. They built a sophisticated underground educational network that spread across Virginia's plantations, all while maintaining appearances of simple obedience. One of their most powerful strategies involved something they called mental freedom exercises. These were techniques for maintaining psychological autonomy despite physical enslavement, ways of thinking and perceiving that preserved black humanity when the system tried to destroy it. They taught people to distinguish between external submission and internal dignity, to understand that playing roles for white people didn't mean those roles defined who black people truly were. Your body might be enslaved, Marcus would explain to new network members, but your mind remains free. They can control your labor, but not your thoughts. They can restrict your movement, but not your imagination. They can try to break your spirit, but only if you let them. Mental freedom means maintaining your sense of self, your humanity, your understanding that slavery is wrong even when the entire white world says it's right. These mental freedom exercises included teaching people to observe without being observed, to learn without formal education, to remember without writing anything down, to communicate in ways white people didn't understand. They taught black people that intelligence was resistance, that every act of independent thought challenged white supremacy's foundations, that developing their minds was itself a revolutionary act. Hannah contributed linguistic techniques, teaching people how to speak to white people in ways that appeared submissive while actually maintaining dignity. You can say, "Yes, master," with your mouth while thinking, "You're wrong," in your mind, she explained. You can follow orders while understanding those orders are unjust. You can appear to accept slavery while internally rejecting everything it represents. Language is a tool. Use it strategically. Benjamin taught mathematical thinking, showing people how to calculate their own value, to understand plantation economics, to recognize when they were being lied to about prices or productivity. They want you to believe you're worth what they paid for you, he said. But your true value is infinite because you're human. Understanding that difference between price and value is mental freedom. Sarah taught psychological insight, helping people understand white behavior, predict reactions, navigate dangerous situations. White people aren't a mystery, she explained. They're predictable once you understand their motivations. They act from fear, greed, desire for power, need for control. If you understand what drives them, you can influence outcomes without them realizing they're being influenced. The network grew slowly, carefully, across multiple plantations. Dozens of brilliant black minds connected through invisible threads of shared strategies and mutual support. They couldn't end slavery. The system was too powerful, too entrenched, too protected by law and violence. But they could resist its dehumanizing effects. They could preserve Black intelligence, Black dignity, Black humanity. They could prepare for a future when slavery would end, even if that future seemed impossibly distant. In 1843, a year after the network began, a traveling Black preacher named Reverend Thomas visited the Harrison plantation. He was a free Black man from Philadelphia, one of the few who'd gained freedom before the Revolution and whose descendants maintained that precious status. He traveled south occasionally, preaching to enslaved Black people, ostensibly spreading Christian messages that white people approved, but actually delivering more subversive content. Marcus arranged to speak privately with Reverend Thomas, taking a risk that the preacher might be trustworthy or might report their activities to white authorities. "Sir, I've heard you speak about freedom of the spirit, even in bondage. I wondered if you might be interested in knowing about some work we're doing here." Reverend Thomas studied Marcus carefully, this 50-year-old Black man whose freedom had taught him to recognize signs of intelligence and resistance. What kind of work? Marcus explained the network, the mental resistance strategies, the underground education happening across multiple plantations. He spoke carefully, ready to retreat to safer topics if Reverend Thomas showed disapproval or suspicion. But instead, the preacher's weathered Black face showed recognition and respect. "You've discovered something important," Reverend Thomas said quietly. "Something I've seen in other places, other times. Black people using their minds as weapons, developing intelligence as resistance, preserving humanity through mental freedom. I've been carrying messages between these groups, helping connect them, but I've never seen anyone as organized as what you're describing." "Could you help us connect with other networks?" Marcus asked. "Could you carry our strategies to other areas, help more Black people learn these techniques?" "I could," Reverend Thomas agreed. "But you need to understand something. What you're doing is more dangerous than you realize. Not because white people will see it as rebellion, but because it is rebellion. Intellectual rebellion, mental insurrection. You're building an army of Black minds that slavery can't control. That's the most subversive act possible, because it challenges the fundamental premise that Black people are inferior. If white people fully understood what you're accomplishing, they'd try to destroy it completely." "So we should stop?" Sarah asked, joining the conversation. "No," Reverend Thomas said firmly. "You should continue, but with full awareness of what you're really doing. You're not just protecting one community or even multiple communities. You're preserving Black intellectual capacity for a future when Black people will be free. You're ensuring that when freedom comes, we won't be mentally broken, won't have internalized the lies white supremacy tells about us, won't have lost our capacity for independent thought. That's sacred work. That's revolutionary work. And that's work that must continue no matter the risks." Reverend Thomas became a crucial link in expanding the network. He carried messages between plantations, shared strategies, connected brilliant Black minds across Virginia and beyond. He taught the network about Black people in the North who were free but still fighting racism, about abolitionist movements that were growing, about international developments like Britain ending slavery in its Caribbean colonies. He provided context that helped enslaved Black people understand their struggle as part of a larger movement toward freedom and human rights. But in late 1843, Reverend Thomas brought troubling news. "There's increasing tension in the South," he told the network's leaders during a visit. "White people are scared. They're hearing about abolitionists, about slave rebellions in other countries, about changing attitudes in the North. That fear is making them more brutal, more controlling, more determined to keep Black people ignorant and broken. You need to be even more careful." The warning proved prophetic. In early 1844, Virginia passed new laws restricting Black gatherings, making it illegal for even free Black preachers to address enslaved audiences without white supervision, increasing punishments for teaching Black people to read, The legal framework of white supremacy was tightening in response to perceived threats. Brennan used these new laws to crack down on the Sunday meetings that Harrison had approved. The law says no unsupervised black gatherings, he told Harrison. I should be present at these training sessions to ensure nothing subversive is being taught. Harrison was in a difficult position. He'd seen productivity improvements from the Sunday training sessions. He recognized that the black workers were more skilled, more efficient, more valuable because of what they were learning. But the new laws and increasing regional paranoia about black education made him nervous. He compromised in a way that satisfied neither Brennan nor the network. The meetings could continue, but Brennan would attend them, and the content would be strictly limited to practical work skills with no broader educational elements. This forced the network to adapt again. The Sunday sessions became carefully staged performances where they taught legitimate work skills under Brennan's hostile observation, while the real intellectual development happened through other channels, in brief conversations during work, through the traveling network that Reverend Thomas facilitated, in carefully disguised teaching moments that white people didn't recognize as education. Marcus developed what he called memory chains, teaching multiple people pieces of information that could be reconstructed when brought together. This way, no single person held enough knowledge to be dangerous if interrogated, but the collective network retained everything. Sarah created psychological maps, teaching people to understand and predict white behavior so thoroughly that they could navigate dangers almost instinctively. Benjamin taught mathematical resistance, helping people calculate their true value, understand economic systems that exploited them, recognize when they were being cheated. But the pressure was increasing. In the summer of 1844, a network member on a neighboring plantation was discovered with a hidden book. The white authorities tortured him to learn where he'd gotten it, who'd taught him to read. The man died without revealing anything, but his death sent terror through the network. If one person broke under torture, dozens could be exposed. The entire intellectual resistance movement could be destroyed. The network held an emergency meeting, debating whether to suspend activities until the danger passed. Jacob, now 19 and increasingly influential in strategic planning, argued for continuation. If we stop every time they scare us, we'll never accomplish anything. Fear is how they control us. We need to be smarter about security, but we can't let fear paralyze us. Hannah disagreed. Jacob, you're young. You don't fully understand how brutal they can be. I've watched people broken by torture. I've seen entire families destroyed because someone revealed information under pain they couldn't endure. We need to protect what we've built, which might mean pausing until conditions improve. Elijah, the eldest and most experienced, offered a middle path. We continue, but we become more cellular. Small groups that don't know about other groups. Information shared only on a need-to-know basis. That way, if one group is compromised, the others survive. The network continues even if parts of it are destroyed. They adopted Elijah's approach, reorganizing into smaller, more secure units. It made coordination harder, slowed the spread of information, limited the effectiveness of their strategies. But it also provided crucial protection against infiltration or exposure. Through all of this, something remarkable was happening that the network members themselves didn't fully recognize until later. They were developing sophisticated resistance strategies that would influence black freedom movements for generations. They were creating models for intellectual resistance, psychological autonomy, educational networks, strategic thinking that would be used by civil rights activists a century later. They were proving that brilliant black minds could operate within oppressive systems, could preserve humanity despite dehumanization, could prepare for freedom even while enslaved. In 1845, a crisis on the Harrison plantation brought everything to a head. Harrison faced severe financial problems. Debts accumulated from poor investments and declining cotton prices. He needed to raise capital quickly, and the only asset he could sell immediately was his enslaved black people. He planned to sell 15 people to a trader who would transport them to the brutal cotton plantations of the Deep South, where life expectancy for enslaved black people was measured in years rather than decades. The network learned about this plan through Sarah, who'd overheard conversations in the main house. The 15 people marked for sale included several network members, including Marcus, whose exceptional abilities made him valuable enough to command high prices. If the sales went through, the network would be shattered, families would be destroyed, and years of careful intellectual development would be lost. "We have to do something," Benjamin said urgently. "We can't let them destroy everything we've built." "What can we do?" Hannah asked despairingly. "We have no legal rights, no money, no power. How can we stop a legal sale of enslaved people?" Marcus had been thinking about this problem since learning about Harrison's plans. "We use what we have, our minds, our knowledge, our understanding of how he thinks. We convince Harrison that selling these specific people is bad business, that he'll lose more than he'll gain." "How?" Jacob asked. "He needs money now. Selling people is the fastest way to get it." "Then we show him a different way to get money faster," Marcus replied. "We show him how changes in plantation management could increase immediate profits more than selling people would. We give him a solution that serves his interests while protecting ours." What followed was the most intense 2 weeks of strategic planning and psychological manipulation the network had ever attempted. Marcus used his perfect memory to identify every inefficiency in the plantation's operations, every lost profit, every unnecessary expense. Benjamin calculated exactly how much money could be saved or earned through better management. Sarah analyzed Harrison's psychology to determine which arguments would be most persuasive. Jacob developed a step-by-step plan for presenting their ideas in ways that made Harrison think he was discovering solutions himself rather than being told by enslaved black people. They couldn't approach Harrison directly. A slave offering business advice to a master would be presumptuous beyond acceptable boundaries. Instead, they orchestrated a series of coincidences and discoveries that led Harrison to the conclusions they wanted him to reach. Marcus arranged for Harrison to overhear a conversation about how a neighboring plantation had increased profits through better crop rotation. Sarah left financial journals open to articles about innovative plantation management. Benjamin deliberately made his work assignments more efficient in visible ways that Harrison noticed. Jacob ensured that Harrison encountered evidence of waste and inefficiency in current operations at moments when he was most receptive to seeing problems. Slowly, carefully, they guided Harrison's thinking toward the recognition that he could solve his financial problems through better management rather than selling people. They made him see that his most productive workers were precisely the ones he was planning to sell, that losing them would reduce future profits more than their sale prices would help with current debts. They helped him understand that some of his financial problems stemmed from poor management that could be corrected. The critical moment came when Marcus took an enormous risk. He approached Harrison directly, something he'd never done for anything beyond immediate work matters. "Master Harrison, I apologize for the intrusion, but I've noticed something about the crop rotation that might help with yield problems." Harrison looked up from financial papers that were clearly causing him stress. "What about crop rotation?" "The South fields have been planted with tobacco for 5 straight years," Marcus said carefully. "My father taught me that constant tobacco depletes soil nitrogen. If we rotate those fields to clover for one season, the soil recovers and the following tobacco crops yield significantly more. That's what your neighbor Mr. Matthews did, and I heard his yields improved by 30%. Harrison studied Marcus with sudden, intense focus. "How do you know what Matthews did?" "I talk to his workers when we see them at the market, sir. They mentioned their master was pleased with recent harvest improvements." This was technically true, though Marcus was deliberately framing it to seem like casual information rather than evidence of extensive intelligence gathering across plantations. Harrison considered the suggestion, his business mind recognizing the potential value. A 30% yield increase would generate more money than selling several workers, Harrison said, almost to himself. Yes, sir, Marcus agreed quietly. And if you also reduced waste in other areas, adjusted the work schedules to match seasonal patterns better, negotiated better prices with factors by timing sales more strategically, those changes together could solve the financial problems without needing to sell anyone. Harrison looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed surprise, calculation, and something like respect. You've thought about this. I've worked this plantation my entire life, sir. I pay attention to what works and what doesn't. What happened over the following week was extraordinary. Harrison implemented several of Marcus's suggestions, saw immediate improvements, began questioning other aspects of plantation management. He postponed the planned sales, deciding to try improved management strategies first. He even began occasionally asking Marcus and other experienced black workers for insights about practical matters, something that would have been unthinkable before. Brennan was furious about these developments. He saw Harrison consulting with slaves as undermining white authority, as validating black intelligence in ways that threatened the racial hierarchy slavery depended on. He confronted Harrison privately, insisting that the master was making a dangerous mistake. They're getting ideas above their station, Brennan argued. You're treating them like they have valuable opinions, like their thoughts matter. That's dangerous. Slaves should follow orders, not give advice. They've lived here their entire lives, Harrison replied. They know details about the operation that I don't see from the house. Why shouldn't I use that knowledge if it improves profits? Because it makes them think they're equal to white people, Brennan exploded. Because it validates the abolitionists who claim slaves are intelligent and capable. Because it undermines everything we've built this system on. Harrison was silent for a moment, recognizing the truth in Brennan's concerns, even as he saw the practical value in the new approach. What would you suggest? Sell the troublemakers, Brennan said firmly. Marcus especially. He's the one putting ideas in the others' heads. Get rid of him, and the rest will fall back in line. But Harrison had grown to appreciate Marcus's value. The plantation was more profitable because of his insights. Other workers were more productive because of his teaching. Selling Marcus would eliminate a voice of independent black thought, but it would also eliminate genuine business value. Harrison faced a choice between ideological purity and practical benefit. He chose a compromise that satisfied no one but reflected the complex realities of slavery's final decades. He would keep Marcus and permit limited consultation with experienced black workers on practical matters. But he would restrict their Sunday meetings again, limit their interactions, prevent what he saw as excessive development of black autonomy. He would use their minds for his benefit, while trying to prevent those minds from developing beyond what served white interests. This compromise characterized the 1840s and 1850s throughout the South. Some white people recognized that enslaved black people possessed intelligence and capabilities that could be exploited for profit. But they remained terrified of allowing that intelligence to develop fully, understanding at some level that truly educated, truly independent black minds would inevitably reject slavery entirely. So they created contradictory policies that used black intelligence while trying to limit it, that valued black skills while denying black humanity. For the network, Harrison's decision represented partial victory and ongoing danger. They'd saved 15 people from being sold south. They demonstrated the power of mental resistance, of strategic thinking, of using their minds to influence outcomes even within slavery's brutal constraints. But they'd also drawn increased attention, increased surveillance, increased white anxiety about black intellectual capacity. We succeeded this time, Marcus told the network during a carefully arranged meeting, but we need to understand what this really means. We proved that our minds are weapons, that intelligence can achieve what physical force cannot. But we also revealed ourselves. They're watching us more carefully now. They're scared of what we represent. That fear makes us both more valuable and more vulnerable. So what do? Jacob asked. We continue, Sarah said firmly, but we evolve. We become even more sophisticated in how we use our minds. We develop new strategies they don't anticipate. We prove that black intelligence cannot be controlled or limited, that the weapon of our minds grows stronger the more they try to suppress it. We also need to think beyond ourselves, Elijah added, beyond this plantation, beyond even our network. We need to preserve what we've learned for future generations, because slavery will end someday. I don't know if I'll live to see it, but it will end. And when it does, black people will need the mental tools we're developing. They'll need to know how to think strategically, how to resist psychological oppression, how to maintain dignity despite dehumanization. What we're doing now isn't just about surviving slavery. It's about preparing for freedom. This long-term perspective, this understanding that their intellectual resistance was building foundations for future generations, gave their work profound meaning. They weren't just protecting themselves or their immediate community. They were preserving black mental capacity for a future they might never see, but which they were helping to create. Through the late 1840s and into the 1850s, the network continued its work with increasing sophistication. Members developed techniques for teaching without appearing to teach, for learning without formal instruction, for thinking strategically while appearing to simply follow orders. They created a rich intellectual culture within slavery's constraints, a culture that valued intelligence, rewarded creative thinking, and maintained human dignity despite systematic dehumanization. They also began documenting their strategies, not in writing, which was too dangerous, but through story and song, through oral traditions that could be passed forward to children and grandchildren. They embedded strategic thinking lessons in folk tales about clever rabbits outsmarting stronger animals. They taught psychological resistance through spirituals that spoke of freedom in both earthly and spiritual terms. They preserved African intellectual traditions through dance and music and storytelling that white people dismissed as primitive entertainment, but which actually carried sophisticated cultural knowledge. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, the network was ready. They'd been preparing for freedom for 2 decades, teaching themselves and their children how to think independently, how to make strategic decisions, how to understand complex systems, how to preserve dignity. When Union forces approached Virginia, black people on the Harrison plantation and across the network had already been mentally free for years, had already developed the intellectual tools they'd need to navigate freedom. Marcus was 51 years old when slavery ended. He'd spent his entire enslaved life proving that black minds were weapons more powerful than chains, that intelligence was resistance, that thinking strategically could achieve what physical force could not. When freedom came, he used those same mental abilities to help his community navigate Reconstruction, to establish schools, to negotiate labor contracts, to build institutions that would serve black people for generations. Sarah, Benjamin, Elijah, Hannah, Jacob, and all the other network members became leaders in their communities. They taught openly the strategies they'd developed in secret. They showed freed black people how to think critically, how to analyze systems, how to resist oppression psychologically as well as politically. They demonstrated that the mental freedom they'd maintained during slavery was the foundation for success in physical freedom. The network's legacy extended far beyond its immediate members. The children who'd been taught mental resistance strategies became teachers, ministers, business owners, political leaders. The grandchildren who'd inherited traditions of strategic thinking and intellectual excellence became civil rights activists, educators, professionals who broke racial barriers.
The great-grandchildren carried forward the understanding that black minds were powerful, that intelligence was resistance, that education was liberation. In 1895, when Marcus was 85 years old, a young black scholar named W.E.B. Du Bois visited him, collecting stories about slavery and Reconstruction. Marcus told him about the network, about mental resistance, about using minds as weapons against oppression. "You developed what I call double consciousness," Du Bois said thoughtfully. "The ability to see yourself through your own eyes and also understand how others see you, to navigate both perspectives strategically." "We just called it survival," Marcus replied. "But yes, we learned to be multiple people at once, to submit externally while resisting internally, to appear simple while thinking complex thoughts, to play the roles white people expected while being fully human in ways they couldn't perceive."
That double vision, that strategic awareness, that became our greatest weapon. "And you passed it forward," Du Bois observed. "We tried," Marcus said. "Some children learned it better than others. Some generations preserved it more faithfully than others. But the core idea persisted, that black minds are powerful, that intelligence is resistance, that education liberates, that thinking strategically allows you to survive oppression while preparing to overcome it. That's the legacy we built. That's what we contributed to black freedom." Marcus died in 1896, having lived through slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, and the beginning of Jim Crow. He died knowing that black people still faced enormous challenges, that white supremacy had adapted rather than disappeared, that the struggle his network had begun continued in different forms. But he also died knowing that black intellectual resistance had worked, that preserving black mental capacity through slavery's darkest days had helped prepare people for freedom, that the weapon of the mind had proven more durable than chains. The story of Marcus, Sarah, Benjamin, and the network they built reminds us of profound truths about human resilience and the nature of freedom. Physical chains can bind bodies, but minds remain potentially free. Systems can restrict behavior, but they cannot control thought. Oppression can limit opportunities, but it cannot eliminate human intelligence and creativity. What the network understood and demonstrated was that true freedom begins in the mind. Before legal emancipation, before political rights, before social equality, there must be mental liberation. The understanding that you are fully human despite what oppression claims. That your intelligence has value despite systems that try to suppress it. That your mind is your own regardless of who claims to own your body. This mental freedom wasn't passive acceptance or internal escape from harsh realities. It was active resistance, strategic thinking, determined effort to maintain humanity and prepare for a better future. It was refusing to internalize the lies that slavery told about black people. It was preserving intellectual capacity, cultural knowledge, human dignity through systematic dehumanization. The network also understood something that modern researchers continue to study, that intelligence is inherently subversive to oppression. Systems of injustice require people to not think too deeply, to not question underlying premises, to accept what they're told about their own inferiority or the necessity of their oppression. Thinking people, analyzing people, strategic people threaten those systems fundamentally because they can see through the lies, can identify the contradictions, can envision alternatives. That's why slave codes across the American South prohibited teaching black people to read. Not because white people actually believed black people couldn't learn, but because they knew black people could learn, and educated black people were dangerous to slavery. Every enslaved person who learned to read was a threat to white supremacy. Every black person who thought critically challenged the system's foundations. Every act of Black intellectual development was revolutionary. The network weaponized this truth. They made intelligence itself a form of resistance. They used their minds to protect their communities, to navigate dangers, to prepare for freedom. They demonstrated that you don't need weapons or armies to resist oppression if you can think strategically, if you can understand systems deeply enough to manipulate them, if you can preserve your humanity and dignity while appearing to submit. This doesn't mean physical resistance wasn't important. Rebellions, escape, sabotage, all forms of direct action mattered enormously. But mental resistance was equally crucial because it could happen continuously, could involve everyone regardless of physical strength, could be harder for oppressors to detect and crush. You can chain a body, but chaining a mind requires constant vigilance that eventually fails. The strategies the network developed parallel what modern psychology calls psychological resistance to oppression, maintaining separate internal and external selves, strategic compliance that preserves autonomy, creating meaning and dignity despite dehumanizing circumstances, building community and solidarity as psychological resources. These aren't just survival techniques. They're forms of resistance that preserve human capacity for eventual liberation. What happened on the Harrison plantation and across the larger network wasn't unique. Throughout slavery's history, across the American South and throughout the diaspora, Black people used their minds as weapons. They developed sophisticated strategies for psychological survival and resistance. They preserved African knowledge systems. They created new cultural forms that carried hidden meanings. They maintained human connections and communities despite efforts to atomize them into isolated property. They thought, learned, taught, remembered, strategized, resisted intellectually, even when physical resistance was impossible. Most of these intellectual resistance efforts remain undocumented because they were deliberately hidden, because written records were dangerous, because the people involved were considered property whose thoughts didn't merit documentation. But the evidence persists in oral traditions, in cultural practices, in the sophisticated strategies that Black communities developed and passed forward through generations. The network story also illuminates something about the nature of intelligence itself. Marcus's perfect memory, Sarah's psychological insight, Benjamin's mathematical genius, these weren't supernatural abilities. They were natural human capacities developed through necessity and practice. Oppression didn't make them intelligent. They were already intelligent because intelligence is fundamentally human. But oppression forced them to develop and weaponize their intelligence in ways that people with more freedom might never need to. This reveals the terrible irony of slavery and all systems of oppression. They try to suppress human capacities, but inadvertently demonstrate that those capacities cannot be suppressed. They insist that oppressed people are inferior while constantly fearing and trying to prevent those people from proving their equality. They create conditions that require extraordinary human qualities to survive, then act surprised when oppressed people display those qualities. The Black people on the Harrison plantation weren't exceptional in possessing intelligence. They were exceptional in how they chose to use and develop that intelligence despite circumstances designed to prevent exactly that development. They were extraordinary in their determination to remain fully human, to think deeply, to learn constantly, to teach others, to prepare for freedom despite not knowing when or if freedom would come. This determination to maintain mental freedom, to use minds as weapons, to resist dehumanization through intellectual development, this became one of Black America's greatest legacies. It persisted through Reconstruction when Black people built schools and universities despite poverty and white violence. It continued through Jim Crow when Black communities maintained intellectual and cultural life despite systematic exclusion. It powered the Civil Rights Movement when strategic thinking and psychological resilience proved as important as physical courage. It drives contemporary movements for racial justice that understand that changing laws requires first changing minds. The weapon that no master could take, the power of the black mind, proved more enduring than slavery itself. Systems of oppression eventually fell, but the intellectual traditions, the strategic thinking, the determination to learn and teach and think critically, these persist. They persist in historically black colleges and universities that descended from schools established by freed people determined to educate themselves. They persist in black cultural and intellectual traditions that maintained continuity despite centuries of efforts to erase them. They persist in every black person who pursues education, who values knowledge, who thinks critically, who refuses to be limited by others' assumptions about black capability.
Marcus, Sarah, Benjamin, and the network they built represent countless black people throughout history who resisted oppression mentally and intellectually, who proved that human minds cannot be truly enslaved, who maintained dignity and humanity despite systematic dehumanization, who prepared themselves and their descendants for freedom even when freedom seemed impossibly distant. Their story reminds us that liberation is always first a mental process. Before laws change, minds must change. Before social systems transform, people must envision alternatives. Before physical freedom becomes possible, mental freedom must exist. The network understood this. They worked to free their minds while their bodies remained enslaved, knowing that mental freedom would persist beyond slavery's end, would provide foundation for building new lives and new communities, would pass forward to children and grandchildren who would carry the struggle toward ever greater liberation. As we conclude this story, consider what it means that enslaved black people developed sophisticated intellectual resistance strategies. Consider what it reveals about human resilience, about the power of the mind, about intelligence as inherently subversive to oppression. Consider how these historical struggles connect to contemporary fights for education, for intellectual freedom, for the right to think and speak and learn without restriction. The weapon that no master could take remains powerful today. Black minds continue resisting oppression through critical thinking, through education, through strategic analysis of systems that perpetuate inequality. The tradition that Marcus and Sarah and Benjamin built continues in every black person who refuses to internalize racist assumptions about their capabilities, who pursues knowledge despite obstacles, who uses intelligence to navigate and challenge injustice. Remember their story. Remember that black people were never passive victims of oppression, but active resistors who used every tool available, including and especially the extraordinary power of their minds. Remember that mental freedom preceded and made possible physical freedom. Remember that intelligence is resistance, that education is liberation, that thinking critically and strategically allows you to survive oppression while preparing to overcome it. The legacy lives on, the struggle continues, the weapon remains powerful, and the story of those who used their minds to resist slavery reminds us that human intelligence, human dignity, human capacity for strategic resistance, these cannot be destroyed by any system of oppression, can only be suppressed temporarily, will eventually prevail because they represent something fundamental about what it means to be human. If this story moved you, if the courage and intelligence of Marcus, Sarah, Benjamin, and the network they built inspired you, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell.
We bring you stories of black resistance, black brilliance, black humanity every week. These are the histories that deserve to be remembered and celebrated, the ancestors whose struggles made our present possible, the minds that proved no oppression could truly enslave them. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about real courage, real intelligence, real resistance. Leave a comment telling us what this story means to you and how it challenges you to think about the power of the mind, about education as liberation, about intellectual resistance to oppression. These stories matter. These lives matter. This history matters. Remember that the weapon no master could take, the power of the black mind, remains strong today in every person who thinks critically, learns continuously, and refuses to let anyone limit their intellectual capacity. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video where we uncover another chapter of Black history that demands to be remembered and honored.